Hello everyone, Thersites the Historian here. As promised in a previous video, we're now going to talk about Civil War book recommendations. With me is Sean Chick, pictured here, and also here giving a tour. Anyway, Sean is here tonight to tell us about which books one should read to get better acquainted with the Civil War. There were a few specific questions, so he'll go over some books which will hopefully address those questions. And then moving beyond that, he'll give some more general recommendations for those of you who are trying to get into the topic. So, Sean, take us away.
All right, everybody. So my overall thing with this is not necessarily to talk about what the classics are, but ones that I think are good and interesting. And actually, I think really the interesting part's what's most important because I can recommend a variety of books that give you the standard interpretations of the war, and that's all fine. But I'd rather give you ones that have a different angle to them and are also very well written. That's a big deal to me as well. So beyond the answering the not some of the recommendation, but the request that we had from the last video, I'll also do stuff about the war, politics, biographies, a little bit about Reconstruction, some stuff about memory, and I also want to mention a few memoirs written by generals after the war. So those are my categories I'm going to get into. But I think it'd be good to do the requests first. So Derek, what did we have again?
Well, one request was for the Battle of Petersburg, which, as I recall, is something you might know something about.
Yeah, now the Petersburg. I mean, you've got the campaign as well, and when exactly that campaign begins or ends is debatable. As far as if you're dealing with the Battle of Petersburg, the main one, June 15th to 18th, 1864. There's my book, and then there's a book by Thomas Howe, who I've spoken to before. I've had dinner with him. Great guy, very nice. He helped me out with my Bermuda 100 book, which is being printed right now. So if you really want to know about that specific battle, I would go with either one of those books. Mine's gonna have a little more information, a bit more up to date, and better maps. But Howe's book is a good book as well. I mean, it was one of the best things about Howe's book actually is his research. Very few holes in it, so it's one of the, as far as his research goes, it's one of the most solid battle histories I've ever read. Very few errors or mistakes. So I can still recommend Tom Howe's book for sure. So no, I would say take a gander at mine and see what you like about it. It's mostly gotten positive reviews. The only really negative review I got, even that guy said it was well written, so there's at least that.
Yeah, well, I guess, as far as negative reviews go, that's not too bad. Um,
Yeah, so look, take a look at it and everything. The gentleman got me negative review was A. Wilson Green, and A. Wilson Green is probably the only historian who's sometimes taken swipes at me. Not like personal ones. I mean like professional ones. Like he really is not that impressed with Beauregard's generalship, not as much as I am at Petersburg. So that's a
uh,
big difference between me and him.
also, one of the other complaints I have seen about the book is a lot of people complain about the editing. I did a lot of the editing for that, so I guess that's on me. But, just so
Oh
everybody
no,
knows.
there was a lot of
Full
editing, man.
disclosure. Okay, well,
That book went through so many different editors, and it went through a proofreader. And you know what? Some mistakes got in there. I can say that I don't think there's as many as these people say, but whatever. Probably also, especially since I was when I did that, I was it was my first book being published. I was a completely unknown entity, and I had to go. I did not go with like what a top flight publisher. You know what I mean?
yeah.
Now, don't get me wrong. Potomac Books is very good to me and everything, and very helpful, and they were efficient with stuff. So no complaints there. I'm just saying that if you go with one of the ones at the University of Kansas or North Carolina, I think you'll get like the best proofreaders possible in those. You know.
Makes
But
sense to
anyway,
me.
that's
Um,
my take on it. I'm overall pretty happy with the book, and almost everybody I know is. So,
a quick
you want
question
more about Petersburg? Take a look at that one.
as a follow up. I see right next to yours, there's another book, The Siege of Petersburg by John Horn. Have you?
Yeah, yeah.
Is that a pretty good book, or how would you?
Oh, John Horn John Horn's a lawyer. I've spoken to him too, exchanged emails. Very nice and helpful guy. His main book he's known for is one on the Battle of Globe Tavern. That's what it's really about. The name of the book, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting because it's not the best title for a book ever. I do have it on my shelf that's in the other room. That's a pretty good book, but that's also getting to the weeds, if you will. Like you're getting to very, very specific battle history, which is the Union offensive to break the Weldon Railroad, which it culminates in the Battle of Globe Tavern. If anybody wants to read that, that's a good one to read. The one you're talking about, Petersburg Campaign, that's an overall book that John Horn wrote, so it covers the entire campaign. If you want an introductory book on Petersburg, that's where you start. Okay?
Okay.
So, yeah, that John Horn book is a good book. That being said, keep in mind what it is. It is not meant to be a super filthy, detailed account of the whole Petersburg campaign, but it'll give you the overall things that happen from start to finish and do it with some solid prose. So I can recommend his Petersburg campaign book for sure.
All right. So I guess that should give people a pretty good place to start with anything Petersburg related.
I will mention one more. The newest Petersburg book, the newest big one, is A. Wilson's Green's book on the first few months at Petersburg. I cannot speak for it because I have not read it. Okay? So I can't speak for how good or bad it is. I simply know the Green's opinion of Beauregard because he said so in interviews, and me and him have spoken about that as well, you know. So I can't comment on his newest book. It's only gotten positive reviews, and anything else I've looked at by him has been good as well. So I can only imagine it's fine, at least.
All right. Well, one of the other requests we got was if you had any book recommendations on the role of German immigrants in the Civil War, or more specifically, the role of, I think his name is August Willich, and anyone else who may have been influenced by Marx or may have been one of Marx's disciples who came over to the U.S. later.
Yeah. So a bit of background on this. There were a variety of political radicals and liberals who fled Europe after the Revolution of 1848. And they moved to the north. A lot of them were Germans, although not exclusively. Well, these radicals, when the Civil War came, most of them are going to back the Union. Most of them had already settled in the North anyway. The Union comports more with their political ideology. So, and keep this in mind, too, that America in the 1800s, I mean, it's hard for people to grasp nowadays, but we were considered the left-wing radical nation of the world, essentially. Like, no other country had as expansive voting rights, so many freedoms and liberties overall. And I know that there's lots of problems with that, but I'm talking about compared to the rest of the world. And that's why people like Karl Marx were very much wanted the North to win the Civil War. They saw that as a victory for the progression of history towards communism, if you will. So the German radicals provided a number of generals. Now, the one that he mentioned, August Willich, is one of my personal favorites. Fascinating guy. Him and Marx they weren't really friends. They kind of debated and got into arguments. I want to say they almost fought a duel or something. But Marx did praise Willich's role in the Civil War. So anyway, Willich is a very good brigade commander during the Civil War, particularly his actions during the Tullahoma campaign. He actually had some innovative tactics. And he was probably one of the Union's best overall brigade commanders during the conflict. But he's not alone. There's a variety of other Germans and other nationalities, too. There's an Irish General, Francis Meagher. He was an Irish radical, and he had to flee after the revolutions of 1848 as well. Here's the thing, though. There have to be books on the Germans and the German generals. I have not run into them yet. There's fewer books than you'd think. Now, I've heard of some historians who are working on that, and I can think of a few historians who could do good work on that, but I haven't run into them. And I fear that's for two reasons that are really speak to weaknesses in the historical profession. On the one hand, in professional history, they try to dissuade you from military topics, particularly if you're an American historian. That's because Military history was seen as what they call drum and trumpet history. One person called it maps and chaps.
Yeah, that's probably the best phrase for it, I think.
Yeah, and so they see that as uh, I'm trying to find the right words for this, but it's like they see like as part of an old they considered it more a part of an old triumphalist history, which got subverted in the 1960s, and as you know, social history became big. Um, as you and me both know, like you can probably count on one hand how many prominent conservative historians there are in America, and I'm not talking about some guy rambling. I'm talking about a professional with a PhD. You just don't run into them very often. And so there's a view that military historians are conservatives. That's essentially a conservative topic. And that is what limits a lot of historical outputs. That's why, sadly, professional historians don't address military topics too much unless it involves social history or one of the Holy Trinity, which is race, class, and gender, with class being a distant third in that Holy Trinity.
Yeah, although in ancient history it is a little different. My
Yeah,
topic
yeah.
is like,
I'm talking about
yeah.
Americans, American historians.
Although I mean, there's a at most universities there's a similar dynamic. Although oddly enough, my advisor has no interest in military stuff at all, even though his advisor was Donald Kagan. But then my advisor also sort of recommended my current topic, which is mostly military. So go figure. I don't know. The
I've
world's a weird place.
honestly, I've honestly found like ancient, um, man. Just as a quick aside, like some of my favorite history books ever is ancient history. Like it's outside of American topics, and to be specific, America, mostly American Revolution to Civil War. I think I prefer ancient history over just about anything else. Get some great scholarship in there. I don't know, just a bit more creative. A lot of times, I mean, don't get me wrong, we're going to go over some really great books here in a minute, but a lot of American historians, I mean, it's pretty forgettable stuff.
Well,
You
I will
know?
say this about American historians: they actually put a premium on readability, that's true for ancient history when it comes to popular histories. When it comes to some of the really academic stuff, though, I've read things that make me want to die because they're so poorly written. I mean, I've read some of the intros for ancient books, at least monographs, are 30 pages long and deal with theory and historiography, and it's written like stereo instructions.
Jesus, yeah. No, you can get some of that same stuff in American history, no doubt. Uh, so but the I think one of the reasons is because, and even if you're a European historian, you're dealing with such a broader brush. America's just what we've only been a country for what 250 years at this point, roughly.
Yeah.
I
Going
mean,
through some awkward adolescence with some extremely premature dementia.
yeah. So we've that's good, man. So American historians get very zeroed in on topics like you'll be like North Carolina progressive women in the early 20th century. That's a book, you know.
Yeah.
And then we're getting Civil War, man. You have whole Civil War books devoted to what in the Napoleonic Wars would be called a skirmish.
Yeah. Was it Bryce Crossroads has a book?
Yeah, that one at least is kind of like battle worthy in many ways. God, what's one like Ball's Bluff? That has a book. Actually, it's a very good book. There's actually a really good book on Ball's Bluff. He actually has a great subtitle. It says "A Small Battle and Its Long Shadow," which he's actually right. The Battle of Ball's Bluff did have a very long shadow, considering how relatively minor the battle was. But let's go ahead. What's our next topic?
Um,
That's something
the final request, because actually only three specific requests, was about Philip Sheridan.
Yeah, Philip Sheridan. I would say the most interesting book to read about him is called Little Phil, which is a reconsideration of Sheridan. So Sheridan is held in very, very high regard up until Eric J. Wittenberg wrote about him. Now, Wittenberg, gonna say Eric J. Wittenberg is considered your expert on cavalry in the Eastern Theater, and he's pretty good about the Western Theater too. He's working on a Tullahoma book right now, and Wittenberg looked at Sheridan and essentially said that he just wasn't that impressed with him. That in the Shenandoah Valley, he outnumbered the Confederates considerably, and he had the full backing of Lincoln and Grant, so no problems there. He considered Sheridan's command of the Union cavalry during the Overland Campaign to be below average, which I agree with. Uh, it's a good book because he goes into a lot of detail about Sheridan's Civil War career, specifically 1864 to 65. Now, that say he doesn't say as much about his role as a division commander, and it's not a true full-fledged biography of Sheridan. Sheridan's somebody I've never read a biography of, and partially it's because I'm just not interested enough in the guy. Like I don't find him fascinating or compelling, really. But the one I did read was Little Phil because I'd heard some stuff about it, and I think it's a very good one.
And this is, to be clear, Little Phil, the story of General Philip Henry Sheridan by William F. Drake, or
No, Eric J. Wittenberg.
Eric J. Wittenberg. Okay, because apparently there are two books called Little Phil about him.
Yeah, I mentioned it's by Wittenberg.
Okay, Wittenberg. Let's see if we
I gotta tell you, man, those
There it
keystrokes
is.
are really loud,
Sorry.
man.
Well,
Yeah,
I was just trying to deafen you. Don't worry.
don't worry. We can't do it for every book, though, man. It's gonna
Okay.
be
All right. So we'll just do it for this one, and then the other ones, you guys can just listen.
all right.
All right.
So before I go on, Derek, just curious, did you have anything you were looking into, interest in the Civil War that you wanted to get a recommendation on?
I can't really think of anything right off the top of my head. The only,
I'll tell you.
well, actually, one thing I'm interested in. What about the battles for Mobile? Are there any books on that topic?
Yeah, there are several. I have the newest one. I met the author. He's a nice guy, but there's some that's something I forgot to mention. And when I was talking about one of the problems with getting a book on the German generals, I'm sorry I didn't finish my thought on that. But here's the deal with it, okay? The German generals, a lot of professional historians might have interest in them because they're left wingers, which most professional historians are, but they're not steered towards military history. On the other end, your average amateur Civil War historian is religious, and even a lot of the professional ones as well. Like I have Timothy B. Smith, fantastic historian, great guy. I've met him. I have his book on Fort Donelson and Shiloh, and I believe in the Fort Donelson book, there's a religious dedication in there. I have Lanny K. Smith, who self-published these really extensive books on Shiloh. He also has religious stuff in there as well, and he was himself a military officer. Now, Timothy B. Smith is a professional historian. He teaches college. Lanny K. Smith is not. He's an amateur. Your average amateur historian is of a more conservative bent politically and socially. That means that for them, they're not going to be quite so interested in what a bunch of Marxists were up to during the Civil War. You know? So I feel like the German generals and the German experience of the war is one of the more untapped topics that people, I mean, I'm not saying there haven't been books on it. I've seen biographies of various figures like Franz Seigel, but I feel like that's a vein that can really be tapped into and people can get some interesting stuff out of. So I wanted to make that one clear right away. So what'd you say again, Derek?
The operations around Mobile and that general Gulf Coast defense, because I've read a little bit about the defense of the Atlantic, but not much at all about the Gulf Coast.
Yeah, the Mobile one I mentioned because the guy who wrote the newest Mobile book is himself definitely an amateur historian. He's like a track and field coach. And he lives in Mobile, and he just started taking interest in the history. And then he dives in the Battle of Mobile, and they have the Fort Blakely area is a park. I've been there. They have some very extensive Confederate fortifications saved. So, I mean, you go there. It's not like going to Vicksburg or anything, but I definitely recommend checking it out if you're in the area. So that book would be The Last Siege, and it's a pretty decent read, solid book. It could probably use some maps and an order of battle, but I found the narrative easy to understand, his arguments clear, and he had some great photographs in there. So that's one worth looking at if you're interested. The Last Siege.
The Last Siege. I have to remember that. I should type it in here so I can remember it.
Yeah. I can't pronounce his last name, but it's like Paul Bursker. Brewski or something like that. Just look him up sometime. Decent book. Definitely a good starter on the topic for sure. All right. If you think
All
of
right.
anything else at the end, just let me know. I'm gonna just start cycling through some books here right quick.
All right, let's do it.
So let's do a few military ones. First one I want to mention is a trilogy considered one of, if not the best book on the Civil War. And I say one of the best, I mean, people who aren't even military historians like Mark Summers and Ron Formasano back when we were at University of Kentucky. They were fans of this book series. And it's the Army of the Potomac trilogy by Bruce Catton. Bruce Catton was not a professional historian. Um, he had worked in he's a journalist. He took an interest in the Civil War, and he wrote this trilogy by the Army of the Potomac. And the three books are called Mr. Lincoln's Army, Glory Road, and then A Stillness at Appomattox. A Stillness at Appomattox won the Pulitzer and is still considered by many to be one of, if not the finest book on the Civil War ever written. And why is that? Because one, Bruce Catton is a superb writer. He puts novelists to shame. Okay? And there are passages of A Stillness at Appomattox that are absolutely beautiful and heartbreaking and powerful. And he also really placed the experience of soldiers at the center. Now, don't get me wrong, there's lots of stuff about what the generals are up to, reforms, movements on maps, but so much of it is done from the soldier's point of view. So it really was a mix of those two of the two experiences with superb writing as well. So if one really wants to know the war in the East from the Union Army's point of view, there's no better guy to start off with than Bruce Catton. What is unusual about Bruce Catton, though, by the way, is that his later books did not really live up to the potential of that. He had a Centennial trilogy, which is well thought of, but not as popular. He did a book called Grant Takes Command. Now, this is important to note. Bruce Catton is one of your first guys to reassess Grant in a much more positive light. Grant Takes Command, I think, is actually a terrible book. The research is pretty thin. The writing really is not very evocative. And that soldier's perspective is not only gone, but you can see Bruce Catton making excuses for Grant's mistakes in 1864 to 65. Like, you compare his passage on Cold Harbor and Grant Takes Command to his passage on Stillness at Appomattox, it's like night and day. And I actually wrote a paper about that when we were at Kentucky, about Bruce Catton's perspective, how it changed from being soldier focused to suddenly becoming general focused, because he really did become a big fan of Grant towards the end. So I love the Army Potomac trilogy. I really can't recommend Grant Takes Command, though. Now, thinking of that in the soldier's point of view, I want to get to who is probably my favorite Civil War historian. That's Larry J. Daniel, and he has a great book called Soldiering in the Army of Tennessee. Soldiering in the Army of Tennessee is all about certain perspectives on the Confederate Army of Tennessee, not the Army of the Tennessee. That's the Union Army that took Vicksburg and whatnot. The Army of Tennessee is the Confederate Army in the West. Some people say they never won a battle. That's wrong. They did. They just didn't win too many of them. They hardly ever won a campaign, that's for sure. And so what Daniel's trying to figure out is what made the experience in this army different than other ones. So you have chapters on things like desertion. You have chapters on disease. He gives you the tables for the rate of STDs in the Army of Tennessee and when they would go up and down.
I guess
Lots
winter
of
quarters.
That's right. They usually tend to go up during winter quarters into early spring-ish time, Army of Tennessee, Soldier in the Army of Tennessee also has great anecdotes in there. I mean, one of the things Daniel really did was he went through as many soldier letters as possible. And one of his interesting points of view is that Daniel puts almost zero stock in memoirs, even memoirs written by common soldiers. That's important because any historian worth their salt knows that a memoir written by a general or a politician is a man trying to defend their reputation, to enhance reputation. Memoirs by common soldiers and junior officers are not treated with as much scrutiny. Daniel will actually tell you to not even use them sometimes. Like he read some stuff that I wrote about Shiloh, where I referenced Sam Watkins, who famously wrote Company H, which is a great book. And Daniel told me I shouldn't use them because it was written after the war, decades after. Me and Daniel won't agree on that one, but I will admit he's got a point there. One of the important things about Soldier in the Army of Tennessee was Daniel probably is the man who figured out how the Army of Tennessee could keep on fighting. And what he found it came down to was small unit cohesion. They had that going on. Even though they were losing, they had that small unit cohesion. So I recommend it. One of my favorite books, great read too. He also wrote another book called Days of Glory, which is about the Army of the Cumberland. And that's kind of like the Army of the Potomac trilogy, but in one massive volume. I do recommend Days of Glory quite a bit as well. Even better written than Soldier in the Army of Tennessee. Great analysis of the Army of the Cumberland from its birth, the commanders in charge, the experience of the soldiers. You get this vast panoramic of war, and you get it with an army that a lot of people don't discuss because the army didn't have Grant and Sherman in command.
Right.
Yeah. Um, I mean, man, oh yeah, a few other military books I can definitely recommend. There's a great series called The Maps of, done by Savis Beatty, which is a one of the best publishers of Civil War books. So what the Maps of series is you have like the maps of Antietam, the maps of Chickamauga, the maps of Gettysburg. What they do is you have on one side of the book, you have the text for what's going on. The other side is the map of what's going on. And you can see these massive battles unfold step by step. So the maps of Gettysburg, for instance, has 150 maps. On
Damn.
those maps, you can see the units moving step by step. It gives you a comprehensive look at how the battles and campaigns unfolded. I haven't read maps of Gettysburg yet, but I have read maps of Chickamauga and maps of Antietam. I think that is by far some of the best battle histories I've ever read because since you have each map going step by step, you can see how everything's developing. So I really recommend that series. It is absolutely superb. Brad Gottfried, who puts it together, is a great guy and excellent historian.
Is this the
You know,
same series where you're working on the Shiloh book?
yes, yes, it is. Me and Brad are working on that one together, slowly but surely. He right now they're coming out with the Gettysburg cavalry books right now. But yeah, when I read maps of Chickamauga, I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. I mean, I really had a light go off and I was like, this is what I want to do. Like, this is the way to do a battle history, you know? That said, I don't mean other battle histories aren't good. I mean, I can mention a few other ones I think that are excellent. There's a Gettysburg by Stephen Sears. Stephen Sears is a great writer, too. Um, Shipwreck of Their Hopes about the battles for Chattanooga by Peter Cozzens. Cozzens is easily one of the best. Both a good writer and willing to state unpopular opinions. You know, like he like essentially in Shipwreck of Their Hopes, he says Grant was pretty much pointless at Chattanooga, which might be going a little too far, but he makes a good argument for it. um, you also, of course, have Timothy B. Smith with Shiloh, Conquer or Perish. Very good account of the battle. The best researched account that we have, definitely. Timothy B. Smith's a very big fan of Grant, should be noted. And I think but unlike some other fans of Grant, he's fairly honest about some of his shortcomings as well. So I can definitely recommend that one. And actually, Larry J. Daniel himself, his book on Shiloh and his book on Stones River are excellent. So you got a variety of great battlefield histories out there. And honestly, battle is when you're writing about it is simultaneously the easiest and most difficult thing. It's difficult because you got to get these details right, and you're dealing with men where I mean they don't even know where some things happened. Like the timing of some attacks, you find when you get into the research is off by hours, especially in confusing battles like Shiloh. But they have a narrative to them, and war is like I would say it's action packed. So there's not really, unless you're a truly terrible writer, there's not many dull moments.
Yeah, and I guess it's worth mentioning with battlefield histories. I mean, like you were saying, in academic history, except for a few departments here and there aren't all that many classes on military history available, and even those that are focus very heavily on institutions rather than on how to write about a battle. And then the other thing, too, is that unless you're a combat veteran, I mean, grad school, even though it is really shitty and difficult, not very similar to a battlefield. Um, and the other thing too is like even when modern veterans write about battles before their own time, the nature of war changes so much that it's really hard to really get a feel for what any of that kind of stuff was like. So it definitely requires a lot of imagination to really recreate a battle, I think.
It does. Two things I've tried to keep in mind is, you know, the dumbest thing I think to include is something where you write about what a general could have done that would have, if they just done that, it easily would have turned everything and they would have completely won. A wonderful example of that is a guy named um, Alexander Bevan who wrote about Robert E. Lee and essentially wrote that, Lee, he essentially was one of those guys made the case, he makes the case that Lee's not a very good general and he made a bunch of stupid mistakes. And if he had just listened to Stonewall Jackson, he would have destroyed the Union Army several times over. And I'm always, when I read these things, I'm always like, that's right. The Union Army's just going to sit by and get massacred. That's what human beings do. They definitely don't fight to the knife. And
Right.
I'm not a big fan of that version of that thing that creeps into military history. And yeah, it is, writing about it is extremely hard. But one thing, I mean, and people have different experiences too. Some people like warfare, like read Ernst Junger's Storm of Steel. He pretty much likes it. And not just him. I mean, there's other ones like Sagittarius Rising, which is about a World War One combat pilot. And you can tell that he likes flying. He doesn't mind the dogfighting as much. Other memoirs, of course, war is absolute hell. Vietnam per Casey, A Rumor of War. Sam Watkins, his company H, and I say H that way because it's spelled company Aytch because he wants you to pronounce H like a Confederate would.
Oh.
Company H. So he is talking about being the First Tennessee Regiment, and he essentially fights in the battles of the West from Shiloh to Nashville. Now, there's some debates. Some people think he wasn't at the Battle of Franklin. He never mentioned the Battle of Bentonville. I'm pretty sure he wasn't there. He was definitely at Nashville, though. He gives a lot of detail on that one. But anyway, my point is that his history, you hear the horror of war and the sorrow, but you also get funny anecdotes. You know,
Yeah.
so you just when you're reading the memoirs, you realize that the war being this massive, violent, and intense experience is also emotionally multifaceted, and you're going to get a lot of different people react different ways. And the best thing you can do, especially when reading the memoirs and especially the letters at the time, is to take them at their word, quote them when you can to help paint a picture of what's going on. And you can tell from some of their writings that, oh, this battle or this part of the battle wasn't as big a deal. And then there'll be other ones where they're talking about, blood running down the hill or bodies stacked up. And, that's your cue to know, okay, this is a really intense moment in this battle. This is a horrible thing. And you need to convey that. And one can never get away from that. There's another type of military history I'm not very big on, which is ones where all it is soldier moves from point A to point B. They get shot at. They suffer this many losses. They retreat or they advance or whatever it might be. And there's nothing in there about the fact that they're doing this, going through this intense, violent event. And I believe that's very important to always keep in mind with any of this. I don't say it just purely for dramatics. I'm pretty anti-war myself. I think that that should always be on people's mind, that war is never, ever, ever to be taken lightly. So anyway, those are a few of my thoughts on it, since that's a genre that I do write in. I do want to mention a few little oddball military history Civil War books before we get into some other stuff. One is called Red River Campaign by Johnson, Ludlow Johnson. I believe Ludlow's his first name. The Red River Campaign, for anybody who doesn't know, was an early 1864 Union offensive into western Louisiana. And Johnson writes about it because he wanted to make an argument that a lot of Civil War campaigns didn't have to do with military necessity as much as politics and economics, in which case he's right. The Red River Campaign is mostly motivated by a desire to seize cotton, which will make people rich, and to show Mexico that America would have a strong presence in the states west of the Mississippi. Its actual material benefit to the Union war effort is practically nothing because the Trans-Mississippi's been cut off, so it's a backwater. Once Vicksburg and Port Hudson fall, anything happening west of the Mississippi is a backwater to the main event. And it's a very well written history and one that has that political and economic angle that you don't get enough in Civil War history. So I thought that was a very, very good book. Another one people might want to do is they might want to read about Civil War infantry tactics. There's a lot of debates about that. A lot of people believe that the rifled musket was this decisive weapon that revolutionized the battlefield. It didn't. While the rifle did have a lot more range, the soldiers weren't really trained to use it, and a lot of Civil War battles were fought in the woods at close range. There's a lot of books on this topic, especially by Earl J. Hess, who's a great historian. But I will say the best introductory book is just called Battle Tactics of the Civil War by Paddy Griffith. Paddy Griffith is English, he's British, and that helps out his book a lot because he doesn't take a parochial view of the Civil War. Like he actually has sections there where he talks about how when he reads American Civil War historians, how ridiculous it is. Like they'll be like, oh, the casualties of this battle were horrendous. And he's like, wow, Waterloo was much worse. Borodino was much worse. Than more men. The number of men who become casualties at Borodino is like the equivalent of Shiloh and Antietam combined, roughly. That's just one day. So Paddy Griffith, very good historian to start off with to learn about the way tactics were in the Civil War and to get a view from somebody who is not American.
Yeah, I guess that's also an interesting thing to point out is I guess most Civil War historians are American, at least probably 99.9%. So it is interesting to get an outside perspective on both how the war was fought and its overall significance. Because I know part of high school history is always, well, the first modern war was the Civil War, and the whole world had their eyes on America, and this really influenced the way that World War I was fought, and this was at the forefront of everyone's mind when they went into that war. Because I guess, they had no war experiences of their own, apparently.
Yeah, that is all bullshit that you just now said. None of it's true. Like I said, almost every advancement of the Civil War that Americans we had the first this, and this. Actually, it all happened in the Crimean War first. First photographs, first field hospitals, first mass use of rifles, really. But more importantly, railroad. Just you name it. Crimean War has it before we do. There's actually a pretty good book about that, although it's very long. It's not one of my favorites, but it's written by Brent Noseworthy, called The Crucible of Courage. Noseworthy is an excellent historian who wrote 3 books on the development of musket tactics, essentially, from through the 17 into the 1800s. And he essentially says, hey, look, most of what everybody thought was happening, most of what American historians say in the Civil War was unique to the Civil War. He's it had already been happening, and other groups, other places were very cognizant of it. If anything, the Civil War is the last major war to have muzzle-loaded cannons and muskets. The Austro-Prussian War of 1866, the Austrians have breech-loading cannons, and the Germans using repeaters and breech loaders. So that's really when warfare starts to become something more like modern. I don't mean the Civil War didn't have some modern components, though, and definitely had some innovations, particularly with steel and iron warships. Use of railroads was very extensive, so it's really the first war where it's extremely extensive for both sides. And entrenchments. We really were really good at entrenchments. That was really our the that was really the Civil War's contribution to this idea of modern war, at least tactically, you know. Um, but all right, I'm going to get into a little bit of politics here. I don't have as much because besides the political aspect not being my precise expertise, I also find a lot of books on Civil War politics to be not very good. Um, Both the writing will be a lot of times dry, and a lot of it will be written from the point of view of, wow, this guy really likes this person, you know, especially if you're dealing with Abraham Lincoln. But I do want to mention a few that I think are a good primer for people and have some interesting things to say. One is actually written by Bruce Catton and his son William together. It's called Two Roads to Sumter. It's an old book. It's forgotten, but it's superbly written. And it's essentially about the lives of Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis up until the Civil War. And it's a good introduction to the politics of the era, to both of these very pivotal and important figures, and to their to the ways in which they navigated their times. And while doing that, you can also see how the sectional tensions are building up before the war starts. So I think it's a very good and very underrated book. Uh, Particularly good for the Jefferson Davis parts because I think William Cooper said this, who's a great historian. Uh, there is probably almost impossible to get a satisfactory biography of Jefferson Davis. On one hand, he's hated by a lot of people in the lost cause because one of the lost cause ideas is that Jefferson Davis lost the war. He's hated by the just cause because they see him as the personification of American evil. And Davis himself is so complicated a figure and one who, in his actions, deeds, and personality, is simultaneously, I find, attractive and repulsive, that I myself would find it very hard to write a Jefferson Davis biography. I think Bruce and William Catton, though, came the closest to writing something satisfactory from what I've seen. Another good one on the opposite, on the other end, is Lincoln's Autocrat by William Marvel. Now, William Marvel is an interesting guy. He is very much an iconoclast. He will go against popular opinion. He's also a libertarian. So he finds a lot of what Lincoln and Davis did during the war politically and morally and legally very questionable. Lincoln's Autocrat is an account of Edwin Stanton. And by the time the book's over, you're going to be very happy that Edwin Stanton was never a Nazi because we probably would have had more dead people in gas chambers. I mean, William Marvel portrays Edwin Stanton as a lying, malicious snake who, if given the chance, would have done even worse and more horrible things.
Damn.
Yeah, it's
How much evidence does he have of Stanton's intentions?
God, so much. He piles it on. I'm not, a lot of biographies, mind you, vary between hagiography, where it's like, oh, this guy's a saint. Lincoln gets that treatment all the time, you know. And think about it. Abraham Lincoln is the Jesus Christ of American history. You know, he died for your sins. You know, the sin of slavery. You know, he's Jesus. As I like to say, George Washington's God, Thomas Jefferson's the Holy Spirit, and Abraham Lincoln is Jesus. So anyway, the other one you get is one of my favorites to read, though, is called The Hatchet Job, where you're like, this guy can do nothing right.
Yeah.
All right. And even when I don't agree with him, I find those books hilarious and entertaining. But Lincoln's Autocrat, he lays it on thick. He makes it very clear that Stanton was a terrible man who probably delayed the Union's victory with numerous major mistakes that he made, both strategically and in organization. His biggest one was Stanton in summer of 1862 shut down the recruiting stations in the North. So there were no new recruits coming in for a few months.
Damn.
And he goes into why that is. The debate is that he thinks Stanton was doing that to undermine McClellan. Or he makes that argument. Actually, maybe did he? I'm sorry. It's been a while since I read this one, and it's a thick book, mind you, not a minor tome. Okay, but anyway, he also gets into the idea that Stanton was allowed to do what he did. He was allowed to be what he was because Lincoln himself didn't have the guts for it, but he knew that Stanton did, so Stanton could act as like Lincoln could be good cop and Stanton could be bad cop, you know?
Right.
One thing is clear, though, by the end of the biography, uh, Stanton was not a man of moral conviction. Whatever you want to say about how good or bad he was Secretary of War, that was not a man of moral conviction. He hopped on whatever he thought was politically expedient through his entire life, whatever he thought was politically an ascendant. You know, so I think it's a good one to read if somebody wants to get into something crazy. Another one about politics. This one's considered a classic. Is Free Soil, Free Labor, Free Men by Eric Foner. Eric Foner, of course, the man revolutionized the way, one of the people who revolutionized the way we look at Reconstruction. Very much a left-wing activist historian, so keep that in mind. Free Soil, Free Labor, Free Men is about the birth and the ideology of the Republican Party, more like the ideology, really. And Foner was trying to argue that the Republican Party was at heart an anti-slavery party from the beginning. A number of historians do not agree with Foner. A number of them think that ideology was not that important, whereas Foner believed that ideology was central to the Republican Party. I'm kind of between the two. I think Foner goes too far, but I think there is a point. I do think there is a unifying belief system within the Republican Party. I think where I have problems with Eric Foner is that he's so obsessed with race that he doesn't quite see the class and the economic issues going on as well. I think that's really a liability there, but it's a well-written book. It's got a strong argument that has to be considered, and I can really recommend that one as a wonderful piece of political history. And last one I want to mention, political-wise, is The Political Crisis of the 1850s by Holt. Holt was opposed to Foner. He really played up the mechanics of party politics. This is not an easy read, mind you, but I believe that Holt's book is excellent, and I believe really gets down to what caused the Civil War more than anybody else. He has another book too, called like The Fate of Their Country, I believe is the name. That's more of a easy, more accessible version of the political crisis of the 1850s. Holt's overall argument is that the Civil War happens because the political parties had a crisis, collapsed, and failed to deal with the situation. Really pins that on the death of the Whig Party. And what's good about Holt is that he talks about issues of economics and immigration as well. It could be argued he downplays the slavery issue a little too much, but I think it's very good that Holt mentions other issues involved. Because one of my problems, especially with contemporary Civil War history, is that it becomes reductionist and everything starts to become about slavery and race. And while those are extremely important to the Civil War, there are other things going on, and Holt is a good way to see that. That being,
go
yeah,
ahead.
go ahead.
I was gonna say
No. Go ahead.
yeah, one other book you seem that which I think goes along with this that you told me to look up was The Inner Civil War. You want to talk about that one?
Yeah. That is outside of maybe A Stillness at Appomattox. That's probably my favorite Civil War book. The Inner Civil War is actually intellectual history, so not as much politics. But what Fredrickson was trying to do in that book is to understand why, when the Civil War happens, you have the abolition of slavery, and abolitionism was the unifying thing for the reformers, the antebellum reform movements. I mean, they believed a bunch of other stuff too. It was, reforming insane asylums, schools. This is where like vegetarianism gets argued for, right? But abolition of slavery tied all these people together. They all believed in that. And his thing in the book was trying to figure out why, when slavery was abolished, did the political reform ideals of America disappear in the Gilded Age, and we became, it became more about money more than anything else. And he says it has to do with the Civil War, that the Civil War did not create a left-wing moment, but a right-wing one. And Mark Summers made a similar argument in one of his essays. It was a brilliant little essay called Why the Civil War Came. So anyway, what Summers and Fredrickson both said was that if you look at what the Union people, what the North talks about when the war starts, and what they talk about afterwards. They do talk about slavery, but they talk about union, nationalism, and there's a rising military and industrial ethos that is born in the Civil War and gets enhanced. And so what Fredrickson's talking about essentially is that at this moment of great triumph, the end of slavery, also comes the death of those antebellum reform movements, or if not the death, at least that they're going to have setbacks and be on pause for a while. Now, of course, a lot of other things do catch on later, such as women gain the right to vote, and then of course prohibition. That's the other thing too. Remember, all these reformers, none of them like drinking.
Yeah, so they're all really fun.
Yeah. I do like to say about abolitionists. I'm like, of course I agree with your program, but I never want to hang out with you.
Yeah.
um, so at the end of Civil War, powerfully written, deep. There's a lot of layers in there. I'm actually planning on rereading it sometime this year because I think I'm going to get even more of it out of it the second time. So I could really recommend that one if somebody wants a more unique take on the conflict. If I want to jump into a bit about some biographies, I mentioned Lincoln's autocrat about Stanton, which that's a biography, but a lot of it's tied to politics. But a few biographies of generals. Now, as a rule, I'm not the biggest fan of biographies for the reason that they're usually too positive or too negative. Grant in particular suffers from that. But I think the best book on Grant that I've read is the one by McFeely, which won the Pulitzer Prize in the early 1980s. McFeely is a superb writer. He did err in doing a little too much psychoanalysis on Grant at times, and keeping in mind that was a popular type of history in the late 70s, early 80s. You'll still get occasional hints of it here and there, but applying psychology to historical figures was popular for a good 10 years, I'd say. McFeely's probably the best example of that. He saw both the positive and negative in Grant, which is why Grant's detractors tend to like McFeely, but they still think he's a little too nice to him. Grant's supporters do not like McFeely overall. That's typically what you run into. But it's superbly written. He's not as good on the military stuff as much as he is on Reconstruction. And I believe his understanding of Grant's presidency is probably the best overall. Because essentially what he says about Grant's presidency is that Grant had some success, but when the chips were down, he abandoned the black people in the South. And even though he favored a peace policy with the Native American tribes in the West, his presidency ends with the Black Hills War. And what he really sees in Grant is not somebody who was humble, but somebody who was jealous and protective of his reputation and wanted to attain the highest office in the land, wanted to be something more. You can see that. When Grant entered the White House, he's the one who introduces fine silverware. He's the first president to live it like a wealthy man and cultivate rich industrial friends. So McFeely's a good one to read in conjunction with probably Foner's Reconstruction, where you get a more positive take on Grant's presidency. That said, if you want another odd Grant book, though, there's General Grant and the Rewriting of History by Frank Varney. Varney's a very good man, very helpful. That's essentially about how if General Grant didn't like you, then he would write you in such a way to where your accomplishments are diminished, such as William Rosecrans, George Thomas, Lew Wallace. The book's a bit in the weeds, but I think overall it's a good one, and it's really good to look at his line of research and see how he comes to his conclusions. Right. That said, I've got a really odd biography I want to mention here, and one of my actual favorites is Joseph E. Johnston by Simons, and I mention that because I don't like Johnston. But Simons is just a superb researcher and a good writer, and he made Johnston human and compelling, and he gave a fair account of him. So I think that's a very good one to go with. But, I'm going to get away a bit from biography and I want to do a little bit on Reconstruction right quick. Before I do, though, you got any questions, Derek, or anything?
No, not really. So I guess with the grant recommendations you have, you say McFeely's a little more negative than positive, maybe, and then you had one that was very positive, and then one that was just like talking about Grant being a backbiter.
Yeah, yeah.
So
Actually, I'd say well, the one I mentioned, Reconstruction, isn't one. I will tell you the best of the positive Grant biographies is Brooks D. Simpson's book. Now he only goes through the military stuff for now. He's working on a second volume with the presidency. He's been working on it forever, apparently. But of all the Grant supporters, Simpson is the best with his research and his conclusions. And that's another one too. Brooks Simpson has a great. If anybody here wants to start off with a good book on the Civil War and the Eastern Theater, I'm going to recommend The Civil War in the East by Brooks Simpson. Good overview of the campaigns and a good analysis of the war in Virginia in its strategic context, with some very good observations too. Like Brooks Simpson is willing to point out that hey, maybe Lincoln's interference in Virginia really wasn't that effective, guys. Like maybe Lincoln's not a great commander in chief. Now he doesn't come out and say that, but you start to get that conclusion in the book. So I can really recommend that one. It's a thin little book too, so a good introduction with an interesting argument to be made as well.
because you've mentioned on many occasions that there is very much a dominant strand of thought right now in Civil War studies where it's very much Grant, Sherman, Sheridan, sort of the holy trinity of generals, and Lincoln, best commander in chief ever. Is there any one person who really kind of set that ball in motion, like a grand doyen of that particular school of thought, or some like starting point?
In the case of Lincoln, it would be his two secretaries, Nicolay and Hay. Um, they wrote a Lincoln biography, and actually they specifically wrote one to make Lincoln into this heroic figure. I mean, they were his personal secretaries, and they were also the ones who created our cartoon villain version of McClellan. They specifically wrote McClellan as Lincoln's adversary. They essentially wrote him as more of Lincoln's adversary than Davis or Robert E. Lee. I think they got that idea, whether they admitted it or not, from George Bancroft, who wrote about George Washington. And in writing about George Washington, he made Charles Lee and Horatio Gates Washington's two. Those are two of Washington's rivals, so he made them into really the villains of the story. So if you're reading George Bancroft, Charles Lee and Horatio Gates can do nothing right. And it's the same thing with Nicolay and Hay with Lincoln. So they set that in motion, but more importantly is that Lincoln died when he died. Now think about this with Abraham Lincoln. His views on Reconstruction were conservative. He was not a radical Republican. Radical Republicans did not like him. Okay? The movie Lincoln shows some of that tension, but not enough of it. Guys like Thaddeus Stevens did not like Abraham Lincoln. Thaddeus Stevens said he regretted that Lincoln was reelected.
Damn.
Yeah, because Lincoln's plans for Reconstruction were soft. So Andrew Johnson, who gets turned to a villain nowadays, and don't get me wrong, Andrew Johnson's not a great guy, but Andrew Johnson was essentially doing what Lincoln wanted to do. He gets subverted. He gets into a lot of political fights with the radicals. It's all crazy stuff there, and the impeachment trial and all the rest. But Lincoln died right when the North wins the war. He gets killed by a John Wilkes Booth, who was probably a Confederate spy, definitely had Confederate spy friends. So he gets killed by a hardcore Confederate. That is perfect martyrdom for you. So Lincoln, the man, the human, the person who did good and bad things, who had strengths and flaws, is gone. Now you have Lincoln the Saint, Lincoln the Messiah. I hate it. I think it's disgusting personally, but I despise hero worship. You know,
Yeah, I do
always a
too.
crock.
Never
It's
been a
always a
big
crock.
fan.
I mean, there are people I admire, people I like, but I mean, there's always something wrong with these people.
Yeah,
Now, then, future.
one of my least favorite things, back especially in high school, early college era, is every time they'd want you to write an essay, it's like write about a hero in your life, or write about someone who's one of your heroes. I've never really been a hero worshiper, so it's always been difficult for me to fake my way through those kind of essays.
I could do it. They had one for that, and I was in high school and I wrote Beethoven, and
Oh,
I think he's still the closest I have to a hero. But I'll admit I'm nicer to artists because I'm like, you know what? Even if they're terrible people, I'm like, at least you're creating something good, you know.
yeah, it's
When it
true.
comes to politicians or military figures, I'm much more harsh. At least, well, I want to point out the good stuff they did, but I know that if you're in that kind of field, you're doing some bad. It's inevitable.
Yeah,
It's the nature of it.
it's kind of hard to avoid, I suppose.
Yeah. Lincoln was a good president, mind you. All right. I mean, he's not, I don't think he's like the best one, but he's a good president. Um, so I think having a positive biography of Lincoln is not a bad idea. It's not even slanted. You read some of this stuff, and I'm just like waiting for him to walk on water and shoot laser bolts out of his eyes, you know?
Yeah,
Most of my problems with Lincoln actually are not his politics or his personality, it's his direction of the war overall. I think it was very flawed, and I think he had some harebrained strategic ideas that held the North back. So I am very critical of him as commander in chief of the army. I'm not critical of him as a politician, though. As a politician, he was superb. Anyway, so that codification also comes from, you're at a moment that is extremely anti Confederate, anti South. And so, regardless of what Grant, Sherman, or Sheridan did to the natives in the West, we're more interested in what they did to the evil Southerners, And yeah, you got people make excuses for war crimes now. Or if you'll mention Union war crimes, they'll mention Confederate ones right back at you. And I'm like, you know what? It's war. People do horrible things. Just
yeah.
be honest about it.
And I think when it comes to especially the prison camps, people went hungry and were exposed. I feel like in some ways, the northern camps, which let people go hungry, are more inexcusable than the ones in the south, just because the north actually had food.
Yeah, I don't want to get into that one because prison camps are not my specialty. I do want to read a book called Andersonville's in the North, which argues that northern prison camps really weren't that bad. It got some negative reviews, so I'm kind of want to dive in and see the shit show, if you will, But there's actually a book that just came out on Elmira Prison, which had the nickname Hellmira. That's one in New York. And Elmira's typically considered like your worst northern prison camp, from what I've read. You know, Point Lookout was apparently pretty rough too, especially towards the end of the war. So I want to get into those and take a look. I do know from some of the stuff I've read and some of the soldier accounts I've read that at least in the first 2 years of the war, prison camps north and south really weren't that bad. You know, that really starts to come as the war goes on, both economic strain and because of vengeance. But once again, nobody quote me on this. I'm talking about general things that I've read, and I'm going to get more into the prison camp stuff later this year, especially since I've been doing some work on Fort Donelson, and Fort Donelson's a big haul of prisoners get sent north. Yeah, no, so just so Grant, Sherman, and Sheridan can get a pass on their other sins because hey, they beat up Confederates, and right now, if you're of the left wing political persuasion, the Confederacy's like the equivalent of the Nazis, which is ridiculous. I mean, but on the other end, Confederacy's a bad cause, pretty bad government, and more important, I don't think they had much of a reason to secede. But that's a whole other debate.
Well, speaking of really overwrought historical comparisons, one of the videos that we made where you were talking about Napoleon got a comment recently where somebody said that Napoleon is just as bad as Hitler because he inspired Hitler. That was essentially the substance of the comment. Would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, it's moronic on its own.
Yeah, no, I agree. I just didn't know if you had something there because I mean, I just like
Hey,
I had
Mao
nothing to respond
Zedong.
to.
Hey, Mao Zedong was inspired by George Washington.
Yeah, I feel like too it'd be like the equivalent of if someone invented the knife to spread butter, and then someone figured out how to use it as a weapon of murder. Then you could say that person who invented the butter knife is just as bad as a serial killer. I mean, it's not an argument, at least not a very good one.
Yeah, I mean, especially you're talking about Napoleon, larger than life figure. I mean, the number of people inspired by Napoleon, it's a pretty long list.
Basically,
And the
everybody in the 19th century.
Yeah, but whatever. Let's not even respond. It's fucking stupid on its own. All right. What was I say? Let's see. Oh, just want to do a little bit about Reconstruction here. A really good book, and it's very specific to this area, which helps. But it's well written, great arguments. Is New Orleans After the Civil War by Nystrom, Justin Nystrom. One of the reasons I love this book is because it is like a perfect balance. On the one hand, there's a lot in there about race and racial politics, as there would be. It's about America and Reconstruction. But at the other end, Nystrom does not ignore political realities and practical politics and how that influenced Reconstruction as well. Not only do you have a very well written book, you have a book that I think really is advancing a deeper argument about Reconstruction, because so many Reconstruction histories are so race obsessed that they lose the forest for the trees. And Nystrom does not. A lot of that involves the mechanics of how parties operated, patronage systems, and also just personal vendettas. Some of these people are not doing things out of ideological stuff. They're doing it simply because somebody they don't like is on the other side. And so you get into the nitty gritty of politics and Reconstruction as well. So I think it's an excellent book to read. Let me see. Another one about Reconstruction. No, I'm sorry, I already mentioned it. Eric Foner's Reconstruction. Controversial book in some ways, but still considered like the standard on it, or at least the one that really set the template. Foner, of course, is a Marxist, so he applies some Marxist perspective there. I want to correct something, though. I earlier said Foner's understanding of class isn't that great. It is much better in a Reconstruction, I find, than it is in the Free Soil, Free Labor book.
Okay.
Sorry. So those are two in Reconstruction that I can definitely recommend. I haven't read as much on Reconstruction. Oh, one other one. Sorry. The Ordeal of Reunion by Mark Summers. I will confess I've only read part of it, but, Summers is a brilliant historian. I've read some of his other books, such as Party Games, about Gilded Age politics. What I've read, The Ordeal of Reunion, it is his magnum opus, most likely. Superbly written, and really argues that Reconstruction is not just about race or the Republican Party. It's also about reunion. That was the main reason the North fought the war, and a lot of it is about them thinking, is another war going to start, and trying to create a country that can be reunified. And they will succeed, although haltingly. But I want to make very clear, I haven't read all of this book, just parts. It's on my reading list for this year, but I have no doubt it's going to be an excellent book. Now, speaking of that, one last book about Reconstruction, but it's more of a memory book, and that's going to close me out for memory, and then I'll do a few miscellaneous things, is Race and Reunion by David Blight. Easily one of the 3 or 4 best written books on this list. A lot of the way we view the memory of the Civil War right now, or at least the view that's popular in the in most of your mainstream media outlets, like say the Atlantic, is going to be found in Blight. So Blight essentially argues that America chose reconciliation at the cost of racial justice, and that the emerging view of the war became the lost cause. Blight, more than anybody else, destroyed the lost cause. He said to believe in the lost cause is not just to believe in a set of lies about the war, but also to advance what's essentially a racist idea, that the Civil War is a war kind of like a brothers' conflict between white men that was gallant and gorgeous, and then the war, sure, we went through it, but we got reunited anyway. And I think Blight is mostly correct. If I had anything against Blight, it's 2 things. On the one hand, he probably downplays the degree to which the North had a separate view of the war. And I do think they had one. I think your 4 memories of the Civil War are the lost cause, the just cause, the reconciliation, the reunification view, and then one I would call the tragic view. Right? And I'll get into the tragic view just a little bit with one other memory recommendation, but Blight doesn't really see the North having its own memory of the war, at least one that he doesn't accept. And I think the reason is because Blight favors racial justice to the degree that he can't see that the Civil War for the North was more about nationalism and union than it was about racial justice. That ending slavery was for many people simply a military measure. It was not a great moral crusade for most people. Most Northern soldiers. Now, that said, it could depend region to region, unit to unit. Your New England units definitely saw as more of a crusade. You start getting to Illinois and Indiana, really not so much. In the case of Blight, I think he downplayed the North having its own separate vision of the war. On the other end of the spectrum, I think the attacks on the just cause might have went into overkill there. Because, I'm sorry, the lost cause, my bad, because arguably there are a few tenets of lost cause that are true and accurate, such as, yes, the North probably won because they outnumbered the South considerably and had a better industrial base. Also, Robert E. Lee was a very good general, maybe not the reincarnation of Napoleon and Hannibal Barca, but a very good general and easily one of America's best. And I think some people have rejected the lost cause to the extent that even the points where the lost cause has a lot to say that's accurate, they dismiss that as lost cause propaganda. And I'm like, oh, well, come on. Lee's obviously a very good commander, you know?
Yeah, I like how, the politicization of, morally neutral quality.
Yeah, yeah. And, besides that, I remember when I finished Blight over 10 years ago, I thought, if this vision ever gets popular, they're going to rip down Confederate statues and they'll never, any sympathy for the Confederate experience will disappear, which I think has its own pitfall because then you can't recognize the economic devastation, the horrible loss of life. The idea that people who really suffered from this are common people. Look, your average planter after the war, a lot of them lost fortunes, of course, but a lot of them came back. Some of them were even richer than ever. At the same time, if you were a poor Southerner before the Civil War, you got a lot poorer after the war. And I think that while the Confederacy was wrong and should not be glorified, and Robert E. Lee agreed with that point of view, I think we do ourselves a disservice, and I think we're being morally simplistic when we don't understand that it was also an experience of suffering. And that still defines how many people in the South feel about it, especially in relation to the North, which brings me to my last memory recommendation, and one that I think I would say is in the tragic school, which is The Legacy of the Civil War by Robert Penn Warren, the novelist. He wrote a series of essays, and this one he wrote in the 1960s amidst all the centennial celebrations where he thought they were false. And he discussed, of course, failures of racial justice, but his real argument was that the Civil War never really reunited the country. Divided the North and the South with two things that he said were poisonous to both sides. He said the South gave them what he called the great alibi, where anything the South did wrong, they could just blame it on the Yankees and the war. Economy screwed up, Yankees and the war. Segregation, well, that's probably because of the Yankees and the war. That it became a great excuse for the South to not improve itself, if you will. But then he said for the North, it gave them something called the treasury of virtue. This idea that, well, whatever we do wrong, at least we're not the South. It's something they can hold against Southerners, regardless of all of their shortcomings. Always remember, your last riots over desegregation were in Massachusetts.
Also, wasn't the most Klan-controlled state ever Indiana in the 20s?
Hello?
Oh, I said, wasn't the most Klan-controlled state ever Indiana in the 20s?
Oh, yeah. At one time, they had the governor, the cabinet, just about everything. And the Klan persisted in Indiana essentially as like a kind of hidden political club, Yeah, so for a number of decades, it seems. There's a book about it I'd like to read about the Indiana clan. Yeah, it's something that people in the South and Warren's got a point. They use it as an alibi, but they know it. They we find the North sometimes on certain issues like race to be rather hypocritical, you know, and that we're just a convenient thing to go like, oh, well, at least we're not like them. There's actually a guy who said that is like he thought that everybody watched Jersey Shore years back to feel better about themselves. Like, like, well, whatever. I'm not as dumb as Snooky, so I must be fine,
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of truth in that. And Robert Penn Warren didn't see the Civil War as, this lost cause worth drawing pride from. That we may have lost, but we gave those Yankees hell. He didn't see that, and he didn't see it as a just cause of a righteous North smiting an evil South. And nor did he see it as a war where, it was a bad thing. We all got back together at the end. He definitely didn't see that. He saw it as essentially tragic, and so do I. I mean, republics are supposed to solve their issues without resorting to mass slaughter. And when people try to glorify the war one way or the other, it's because we can't accept that bitter, bloody fact that we could only resolve a certain number of differences through mass slaughter. And yeah, and just find it hard to glorify it too much.
For sure.
Anyways, so I think that's a good one to go with. Race and Reunion by Blight, and then Robert Penn Warren's The Legacy of the Civil War. Get two different perspectives on memory of the war. If you want one about the lost cause that I think is particularly good, it's called Never Surrender, which is about South Carolina's memory of the war and how it was manipulated afterwards. That was a pretty good one, too. I liked that book. Anyway, I think I'm going to look through my list real quick and see if I got any other like loose ends I might want to mention.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll go through a few other ones right quick. Probably my favorite Beauregard biography. You've got T. Harry Williams, also Hamilton Basso, who was a novelist in the 1930s and reporter. His is very well written as well. And Basso was able to, and actually Williams was able to do a little of this too, but Basso even more was able to interview people who actually met Beauregard in their lifetime. So he had some firsthand account stuff there that was really good. Lee's Tigers.
Oh,
go ahead, sorry.
Didn't Basso interview Beauregard's son, or am I getting that wrong?
No, he didn't. Beauregard's son was gone by that time.
Oh.
But anyway, another good one's Lee's Tigers by Terry Jones is about Confederates, Louisiana Confederate units in Virginia. Fantastic read, great stories in there, lots of good anecdotes, some pretty good social history without being bogged down the drier aspects of it. Also talks about desertion. Why did the Louisiana units fight so hard yet had high levels of desertion? So good stuff in there. Another one would be Pistols and Politics by Samuel Hyde, who's another professor of mine. And I had heard this was a good book. I read it last year and I was blown away. It's about the Florida parishes of Louisiana. Those are the parishes that are essentially east of Baton Rouge and north of New Orleans, because that area used to be part of Florida. And the book talks about the parishes before the Civil War, during the war, and then after the war. And you really get a feel for how the devastation wrought, because Louisiana in particular suffered very heavily. The Union Army around here were a bunch of pirates, and how that economic devastation fueled political violence after the war, even into the 1890s. So very good read with lots of good sociology in there. And another one, Decision in the West. That is about the Atlanta campaign by Castell. Very good book. I like Sherman. Castell doesn't, so it's interesting to read that. There's Allegiance, which is about Fort Sumter. Good read on it. You get a lot of feel for the personalities involved. And last but not least, I want to mention Seen the Elephant by Franken Reeves. And that's a good book. It's about the experience of combat for soldiers at Shiloh. Um, and I think of all the books that I've read about general soldier experience in the Civil War, this one is the best because it talks about what they did before Shiloh and then while they're at Shiloh. And that's important because most of the Union and Confederate soldiers on both sides had never seen a battle before that. And that is one hell of a baptism of fire to go through. Shiloh. I mean, you had a significant number of Union troops who did see battle at Fort Donelson, some at Belmont. A few Confederates saw battle at Mill Springs and Belmont, but even them, Bell Springs and Mill Springs and Belmont do not equal Shiloh in ferocity. So I found to be a very, very well written book, and definitely one that I would assign if I was teaching a class or if anybody wanted to read more about the experience of soldiers during the Civil War. And I think that finishes up for my list right now. Did you have a question about anything? Like anything else you might think that I should mention a recommendation for?
Oh, one last thing that I find interesting that maybe you have a book recommendation on. How about the Civil War in East Tennessee where all the Unionists lived?
Oh yeah, yeah. I'm not as well versed on that one. Some people are talking more about the rebellion there because East Tennessee rebelled in late 1861, and the Confederates had to keep sizable forces there both to hold the place and defend it. I've only read one book on any kind of fighting there because there really wasn't a lot of fighting. You had a lot of bushwhacking though because East Tennessee's divided. That's important to keep in mind too. East Tennessee was strongly Unionist, but they also did have some strong Confederate sentiment there too. So you had a lot. It was like a civil war within a civil war, much like you could run into in parts of Kentucky and definitely Missouri. I did read a book on Longstreet's Knoxville campaign that was pretty good. I can't remember who wrote it. I think it might have been Hess. But that's all I've really read about it. It's just the Knoxville campaign book.
Ah, well, I don't have any further questions unless you can think of anything else that people might find interesting on the
You
topic.
know, this is gonna for me. This will close up the Civil War videos we've done, right?
Yep, I think so. Because certainly, I don't have the expertise in the Civil War to rattle off anything new.
Yeah, yeah. Maybe do something in the future on like controversies or Civil War movies or something like that. But for now, we're going to be giving the American Civil War a pause, and you and me probably be talking about some other stuff, right?
Yeah, probably talk about some Napoleonic marshals or Soviet premiers or something along those lines.
Sounds good, man. All right, Derek. It's been great talking with you.
All right, you too. All right, peace out.
Later.